Okay, so this is a Pioneer DJM800, which is a massively popular DJ mixer that came out around a decade ago, I think. Although they were discontinued probably 7 or 8 years ago in favor of the DJM900, they're still very commonplace in clubs because they're built like a tank and they're very easy to they're very easy and cheap to repair, and they're easy to use and sound half decent, so we see a lot of them in for repair. Now, repairing a Pioneer DJM800 is a lot like making love to a beautiful woman. First of all, you have to put it into service mode by holding down harmonic, fader start 1 and channel 1Q while turning the power on. What service mode does is it lets us test all the control functions of the mixer, so that's the faders, the pots, the switches, the buttons, separately from the audio. And this is really useful when we're trying to trace a fault that is in one of the pots or faders. In this case, the reported problem was one of the faders isn't working, so we're going to look for that first. Also, the master volume apparently doesn't work either. Now, what I'm doing here is, as you can see, the lights on the EQ are lighting up in proportion to where the fader is. And that just kind of tells us, as I sort of wiggle it up and down, whether or not the fader might have problems. Now, you can see channel 4 here, as well as having a slightly loose knob. The lights are kind of flickering and not really working properly compared to where the fader should be. So yeah, there's something definitely wrong there. So normally that just means it's dirty. There's a few scraps of dust in it. So I'm going to squirt some of this fader clean stuff called Deoxit D5, which is very good but quite expensive for what it is really. So you try and use it sparingly. Just a couple of squirts normally just fixes anything apart from the most dirty faders. And yeah, you just sort of work it in and then give it a final squirt, and then you're fine. After 2 minutes, you can turn the device on. Okay, now we're just going to put it back into service mode just to test that that's fixed the fader. Yeah, that's us up in service mode. Now it's the fader test one we go to, so FDR test. Yeah, there we go, and that looks a lot healthier. Still looks like it's flickering a bit on this video, but that's just because of the camera shutter. But yeah, that looks really good. It's good to just wiggle the knob left and right just to make sure we detect any problems with it. And that's just checking the crossfader as well, because we forgot to do that last time, but it seems fine. So that's one problem solved. Now, the other reported problem was the master volume knob wasn't working either. And if we sort of turn it, you can see that it's just the position of the knob isn't corresponding to the lights at all. That's the lights on the right channel of the master one. And yeah, the stem of the pot feels really loose and just like it's not connected, so probably it's broken off on the inside. So unfortunately we'll have to take this mixer apart to fix it properly. Now we just start by removing some of the screws on the faceplate. Now I have these little plastic box things for putting screws in, and I think they were like 100 for £1 from CPC or something like that. And they're really great just for keeping screws and like small knobs and stuff like that in. And they sort of clasp shut, so you know, if you ever have to sort of abandon a repair halfway through and then pick it up a few hours later, all the screws haven't gone everywhere. Alright, I'm going to speed up the playback for removing all the knobs from the top of the pot. I like to use a blunt flathead screwdriver to sort of prise them up. You've got to be careful not to scratch the paintwork, but it's pretty easy to use and it's a good one. And now I'm just getting a few screws I forgot to get last time. Okay, now faceplate comes off. First thing we need to do is remove the nuts from the top of the pot. Now luckily the master volume pot is on a separate circuit board along with the FX pots, the booth output volume and the balance control, and that'll make it a lot easier, because otherwise we'd have to remove every single nut from every single pot on the whole board, and that would be an absolute nightmare. But luckily, it's occurred in this section, so we only need to remove a half dozen. Okay, now we need to remove the screws from the circuit board on the other side. As you can see, that's the separate circuit board on the left-hand side there that I was talking about. First, you just need to pull out the flat flex cables. Got to be careful doing this because they're not indestructible, although, you know, they can take a bit of punishment. And it's actually much more... they're harder to get in than they are to take out, put it that way. But yeah, there's just a half dozen screws to take out on this board, and then we can remove it and see what sort of state the pot is in. Okay, now this is the circuit board containing the master pot. Now, if you look at the stem on this pot, it's absolutely broken completely off. So yeah, I think probably the thing to do will be to replace this potentiometer. I mean, we could maybe repair it, like put it back in and like refashion the metal springs and possibly use some glue, but as I've got plenty of spare pots for this, it's probably just better off using one of them. So yeah, first things first, we're going to have to desolder the old one. I'm going to start by adding a bit more solder to them, and this is lead-based solder, to sort of kind of dilute the lead-free solder that they'll have assembled it with. And lead-based solder is a lot easier to work with. It's just generally flows a lot better, and I think it melts at a lower temperature as well. Maybe not, I don't know. Now I'm just going to clean off the solder pads with some isopropyl alcohol. That's just to get rid of any old burnt flux or any other bits and pieces. And I'm going to apply some fresh flux to the joints as well as fresh flux to this solder braid. Now I much prefer using solder braid than solder suckers or any of these other solutions, just because you get all the solder out of it using solder braid, and you can kind of see how it's working, and it's a bit better to use, but it can be a little bit fiddly. But it's pretty much an essential for surface mount work. Not that this is surface mount work, but it's just useful for everything. And yeah, so we're just sort of heating up the solder flux against the joint, and all the old solder from the old pot's joints just kind of flows and wicks up into the solder braid. Now, the two larger solder connections in the pot, just the ones that hold it physically to the board and kind of connect to the casing of the pot, I'm going to use a solder sucker to get most of the solder out first, just because, you know, otherwise it's a waste of solder braid. And once I've got most of it out with that, I'm just going to use the braid to get the rest. Okay, now we've removed all the solder, we can just pull the pot out from the other side. It's just coming away in parts just now, which is good. And yeah, looks like we've got nice clean solder pads, or at least they will be when I've cleaned them. Now, this is the same board out of another Pioneer mixer. It's actually one that got written off, and I think we just bought it off the guy for 100 quid. We've just been sort of using it for parts for other mixers for, I don't know, a few years now probably. And yeah, I'm just going to steal the booth monitor pot from this. So yeah, I'm just adding more solder to the joints again, just like before. Essentially, we're just going to do the same thing again, add more solder, suck it out with some wick and a solder sucker. And the good thing about this being a digital mixer is most of the pots are essentially interchangeable. This is because, unlike, for example, in an analog mixer where the treble, middle, and bass pots will be used actually as part of the EQ circuitry, and as a result, they actually need to be specific values. In a digital mixer like this one, all the pots are usually all the same value because all they're doing is telling the DSP what position the pot is turned to. Okay, now we've desoldered it. We have the replacement pot for the other board. So let's go and put it in. So these just have little clips on them that hold them in place, so you don't need to take them down or anything, and you just plonk them in the circuit board and solder them on the other side. It's really good. Dead simple. So yeah, once we've inserted it, we just solder the other side and we're golden. Now we need to test it in the mixer, so we'll just plug it back in and give it a go. We'll just put a couple of screws in either side just to hold it in as good as we can, but that should be plenty. We'll also have to remember to put in the flat flex cables. Okay, so let's start it up in service mode again. Make sure that worked. Alright, so go to the fader test screen. Volume test screen, rather. And yeah, that seems to be it. It's now got the full range of the pot and it's all working great. Now I'm just running through all the other tests in the service mode, just in fast forward because it takes ages. And essentially, yeah, it's just checking all the pots, all the switches, all the buttons, just to make sure they're all wired in and there's nothing wrong with them. Now it's time to test the audio in and out of the device. We just connect a couple of XLRs to the master out and some audio into the channels and see if we get anything. I like to put the plate back on for this because often it's not obvious just from anonymous grey faceplate exactly which control is which. So this helps quite a lot. So yeah, we seem to be getting audio into channel 1, no problem there. If you look at the lights, they're flashing, so that all looks good. And yes, we have audio out in the master. You can't hear that, but yes, believe me, it's working. So yeah, now we just need to put all the screws back in. Remember the ones underneath the circuit board we didn't get earlier. Then the nuts for the pots on the master and FX circuit board. Give them a good tightening with a pair of pliers. Now, while we've got the faceplate off, might as well give that a clean as well, make it look all shiny and new. For that I'm going to use Servicol Foam Cleaner 30, which is a great cleaning agent. The foaming action actually does a lot of the cleaning work for you and gets into all the little nooks and crannies and bumps of the faceplate, and it just gets it really clean really, really quickly, and it looks really good. Now, after giving the faceplate a quick dry, we put it back on and screw it back in. This is usually where I discover I've got 5 leftover screws that should have gone in the inside and I have to take the whole thing apart again, but not this time. Now put all the knobs back on. The first few times you do this, it helps to kind of Google a picture of the mixer so you know which knobs go where, but I've probably taken 100 of these apart by now, so I know exactly where they all go. Then just one last quick power on test just to make sure I've not broken anything, and yeah, we're good. Working mixer, ready to go back to the customer.